Today is May 14th, 2015. We are in Savannah, Georgia, at the Wormslow Library. We are with Sarah Ross doing an oral history for the Georgia Environmental Oral History Project. And I'm Christian Lopez. I'm here with Kat Stein from the Hargett Library at the University of Georgia. Sarah, thank you for joining us today.
It's always a pleasure to see you, Christian. Thanks for coming.
Oh, same here. Thank you for having us. If you would you please tell us your full name and where you were born?
Sarah Virginia Ross, and I was born in Columbus, Georgia.
And so, how long did you live in Columbus?
I lived in Columbus just for 2 years, and my father was at the University of Florida, offered a position there in pathology. So I grew up in science. We moved to Gainesville and lived just south of Gainesville in a small town called Micanopy. The U of F ski club was at the lake in my backyard. So I watched students every day of my life growing up, skiing and having fun right in my front yard. And having a dad that worked in pathology, I could walk to his lab after school every day, and they were doing brain research at the time in the med school of Shands. So there would be electrodes in the tops of these mice heads, and I would move the dead mice away in the fridge to reach for the Coca-Cola in the back as a snack, or getting a cold candy bar out of the freezer and yet more dead white lab rats in there. So I literally grew up being a part of science, and science was a part of my life. I didn't know people didn't do science. So one of the projects that my dad worked on, he ran the first electron microscope that the University of Florida ever had. These microscopes were very large at the time, and they were made in Japan. They were shipped from Japan in solid mahogany cases. These cases were 12-foot cubes, and he brought home the first case, solid mahogany, and turned it into a dollhouse for me and my sister, shingled the roof, and put it on a porch. So I grew up playing in the case of an electron microscope. So science really has run everything about my life ever since.
Wow, so you grew up sort of almost in the academy, kind of, or very much having a sense of that, and science. So do you remember when? So it sounds like there's some of one of your earliest recollections of being fascinated with science and having an interest in science. When did you sort of have a sense of the environment in which you were living and how science was related to that, perhaps ecology or the role of science with the environment?
Well, I was fortunate to grow up right outside of Micanopy on Lake Wahlberg, and that environment, we had a large piece of property on the lake. So we had small boats, small sailboats, small fishing boats, and from the time I could paddle a canoe and sail a sunfish by myself, my parents let me go out on the lake, which is surprising to me now as an adult when I think about the sheer number of alligators that were in that lake, to let small children out there by themselves, completely unsupervised, every day during the summer, swimming and fishing and turning over in sailboats and righting themselves back up. But I loved it. So as hot as it is in Central Florida in the summer, and it's humid and it's buggy. In fact, they shot the Tarzan movies not too far, a bicycle ride from my house in Silver Spring. I just loved it. So I was picking up snakes and making terrariums and collecting insects and putting them together in jars. And surrounding our neighborhood were people like Archie Carr, who is the person who really started the international movement for sea turtle research, was one of our neighbors at the University of Florida. Eugene Odom, who was at the University of Georgia, his brother was at the University of Florida. So these were the people that I was growing up with. I had chemistry classes with Archie Carr's sons. So it was part of everything I did every day during the summer. I just always loved science. And one of the things that and my parents did as well. So my father would caught a small green snake one day in the summer and brought it in, and the snake lived in the big planters in our living room for months, and then we would rotate that snake out and bring another one in. My grandmother didn't think this was as exciting as the children did, but it was wonderful just to not have the snake in an enclosure, but to have it where it could be anywhere in the house it wanted to. And we knew it would want to stay in the planter, and it did. So we would rotate animals in and out continuously. So we periodically, my brother was riding his bicycle around the house and realized that there was a very large, when we measured it later, 5-foot diamondback rattlesnake. So he's riding his bike down the hill, and he slams on his brakes. Of course, you're backpedaling as a kid to slam on brakes. And what happened was the bicycle stopped right on this large snake. So my brother jumps off and comes into the house. The snake is somewhat pinned under this bicycle, which has just landed on the top of him. So the snake was there long enough for the rest of us to come out and be able to observe the snake. And later we were able to measure the snake, and I won't go into how we were able to do that. So we had alligators by our front door and would have to go around and enter and exit through the back door because the alligator was quite annoyed that we wanted to get past him because it was a beautiful sunny spot. So there's continuous interactions with wildlife. I was very fortunate. I went to the private public school, P.K. Young, which is part of the University of Florida teaching school. And they let me, as a 10th grader, leave high school 2 years early when it was quite unusual at the time. So I started college 2 years ahead of anyone else in my high school, and I was taking classes full-time. And I went to the Santa Fe Community College for those 2 years. But I never told my parents. They thought I was riding my bicycle to high school every day, and I was riding almost 11 miles to Santa Fe Community College every day. So I surprised them by walking through graduation at high school and to your degree in science from community college the same month. So they had no idea until that point. I literally mailed them the invitations to graduation. It was the first time they knew what was happening. So I had a lot of leeway, and I really liked figuring things out for myself and trying things and pushing limits, like not telling my parents I was doing that and wanting to surprise them at the end. So figuring things out is something I really enjoyed. One of the things I was doing while I was taking those first 2 years as part of my 11th and 12th grade in high school and first 2 years of college, I was also working part-time at the University of Florida in plant pathology. My dad was in working with human pathology and brain research. I was in plant pathology and got to be such good friends over those 2 years with so many of the researchers there that I ended up going back for spring break when I was transferring to Florida State University to Scotland, and ended up living with the family of one of the plant pathologists, and his daughter and I were the same age for the next year in Scotland, and was in and out of his lab and was able to do some things that were really interesting to me, supported by him at the time in Scotland.
You're 17 or 18, and you're working in a plant pathology lab.
That's right. Actually, I started when I was 16. I'd only had my driver's license for a few weeks, so I had a car which I sold a year later for $50, to give you an idea of the car, one of the really, really old Volvos. So one of the pets we had in the Volvo was a peacock, and my mother was a big runner, and she stepped on the tail of the peacock trying to figure out if it was hurt or not, and landed on top of it. So she grabbed it, brought it back, and we built a very large, a 20-foot by 20-foot cage for the peacock and put him in there. So I donated the animal to the teaching zoo at Santa Fe Community College and had to drive that stick shift Volvo holding a peacock down the interstate to get it to the enclosure at the zoo. So it's just continuous animal escapades. It seems like, I don't know how it happens. I just had this vortex for natural history and animals.
When did where did you get your bachelor's?
So when I came back from Scotland,
Right.
I stayed there for a year. The only reason I came back was my plane ticket was expiring, and I knew it would be difficult to save up enough money to buy another one. So I came back, and on the plane on the way back, I got off in the Atlanta airport and just never got on the plane to go back to Gainesville, and decided I was not going back until I figured out what I was going to do next. And so I got a job next day with a temp agency, got an apartment. In 3 months, I figured out that if I was going back to college, I would need to support myself. So I opened a business first.
What year was this?
I was 19 years old, so it was 1977. So at 19, I bought a used van. I drove around the Southeast looking for the city that I wanted to open a business in. And what I was looking for is a city that would have economic stability. And what attracted me to Savannah was the port, the diversity of businesses here, the fact that so many large businesses and industries are owned by people in Savannah. The sugar refinery, Savannah Foods, Savannah Bank came very soon after. So many of the investors lived here. And the other thing I liked were the trees. There were strong tree ordinances. The plan for the city was the same plan from Oglethorpe. In fact, I spent 2 weeks in historic Savannah without realizing that there was a south side full of sprawl. So it was wonderful to be able to live downtown in Savannah. I opened up an art gallery and a frame shop because I knew that I could teach myself how to do that. I borrowed money from a local bank. The female banker, still to this day, is a dear friend of mine, and ran the business for 10 years, and it made it possible for me to get 3 college degrees from Armstrong State Atlantic University. And so I have 2 undergraduate degrees, 1 in fine arts, art education, and except for physics, biology. Funny, I never found time while I was running a business to take physics, other than that. And then I got a master's degree in science education from Armstrong, and then came back a year later and taught graduate level science education classes as an instructor for Armstrong while I was working a full-time job with the federal government. So I've had a long relationship with Armstrong here. And it was during that time as a graduate student when Larry Babbitts, who is a maritime military archaeologist, I took archaeological analysis classes from him. He's the one that got me started at Wormslow in 1982, working on the Civil War batteries. And one of the papers that he wanted me to assist with was tracking the movement of both Confederate and Union troops by the location of the buttons or any other metals that would have been associated with them from here all the way north to the Mason-Dixon line. So one of the things we did was we physically mapped the Civil War batteries. And in 1982, we did not have LIDAR like we do today. Mm-hmm. We were literally out there with meter sticks and string and levels, mapping the entire third of a mile of the batteries themselves. So today it's been very interesting to me using very high-tech tools and coming back and overlaying the data that we're able to collect on top of what we'd originally done in the early 80s and seeing, yes, what a good job it was, but also being part of history to see how fast technology has changed in how we collect data, how we archive data, how we are able to analyze the data, and then how we communicate those data has been transformed since I was an undergraduate.
Well, it sounds like that the Babbitts project was one of the earliest full-on research projects here, because I know Kelso came in '78.
That's right.
And it's just 4 years from that. Are you aware of other projects in between Kelso's and yours and Babbitt's that took place? Or?
Yes, there was one of the first studies was on small mammals, voles in particular, that were here, and it was a professor at Armstrong who did that, and his work was supported by the Wormslow Foundation. And I will think of his name in a few minutes. I think it was Davenport. I think it was Dr. Davenport. We can check on that.
Okay, I think Craig may have did that. So you've been doing research here in Wormslow since 1982. Can you give us a sort of a sense of what your perception of Savannah's and perhaps the city government and maybe the county and sort of how they felt about Wormslow? Was it as a citizen and not yet involved with Wormslow as you are today, what was your sort of gauge of the general population's feelings about the property? Just whatever your sense was. I realize you can't speak for the population, but.
Well, Wormslow has been under private ownership since the 1730s, technically since 1736, although Noble Jones occupied the property before that. And being under private ownership, it meant that anyone who was allowed on the property came as a guest of the family that was here at the time. So the public wasn't allowed to come to Wormslow until the 1930s, when part of the formal gardens were opened as a way to raise money for that generation who were having some financial hardships at the time. So they replanted the gardens and literally turned it into a tourist enterprise as a way of them being able to physically maintain the economics that they needed to keep this place going. That was very short-lived. Since then, the public has not had access. And I think Craig Barrow spoke more about the reason that his father decided to transfer 822 acres of Wormslow to the state of Georgia through the Nature Conservancy. And one of the reasons that his father decided to do this was not knowing what would happen in the future with the burden of taxes, with the potential burden of inheritance cost, and with maintenance costs of the property itself. So the property had people on it. There are a number of stills. We have mapped more than 24 stills where people were coming illegally onto the property and distilling spirits. So his father was dealing with that. There were public needs that were a threat to the site. The Alley of Oaks was potentially going to be condemned by the Georgia Department of Transportation. They wanted to be able to level the Oaks and turn that into a 2-lane highway to be able to get to Skidaway Island easier. And Craig's father, Craig Barrow Jr., and his son, of course, is Craig Barrow III. Craig Barrow Jr. fought that. And that's how the Diamond Causeway was placed on the marshes today outside of Wormslow. So what happened in 1972 when that 822 acres was transferred to the state, and once again it went through the Nature Conservancy, TNC had to hold the property. Jimmy Carter was governor at the time, and he wanted to start the Natural Heritage Trust program. And any lands that came into that program had to have both ecological, historical, and cultural value. Jane Yarn was instrumental in making this connection between looking for the premier property to begin this program. And so she connected with Wormslow and with Craig's father. And so she was the primary person negotiating all of this deal. She is perhaps the single most important and the most influential environmentalist that the state of Georgia has ever seen, even to this day. And as a female at the time, it's even more remarkable. She was relentless. She was a force of nature. She was articulate. She was very smart. She had perfect social graces. She was politically well connected. Her husband supported her fully, and she was powerfully capable of doing what she wanted to do. It could not have been a better person to achieve what she achieved.
So Wormslow, in the late 70s, after the court case and after Nature Conservancy and DNR, Department of Natural Resources, become partners in this. And then a few years later, you're doing research with Abbott. What are you thinking in this opportunity? What is it like for you coming onto this property at that time? And we'll talk about maybe how it differs now, because certainly I think considerably. But as a young scientist, coming onto this place, which, had you been on the Wormslow property at all before that, or prior to coming on doing your research? Because it would have been open for a few years prior to that.
Yes, you're right. No, I hadn't, not until 1982. And in 1972, when the property was transferred, it was not open to the public until 1976. So it spent a year in the Nature Conservancy, and the legislature had to create, the Georgia legislature had to create the legislative language to be able to receive this gift to the state. So that was time consuming. And then there were some back taxes that had to be rectified and corrected. So there was a little bit of paperwork that had to happen to make that transition from private foundation. This was Wormslow Foundation,
right,
not private property. But one of the reasons that the property went to the state Supreme Court for taxes was the public use was questioned. And the Wormslow Foundation's argument was, since they allowed some nonprofits to hold events here, that then the property should not be in a taxable state. It should be part of a foundation and should not have real estate taxes. So one of the reasons it appears to me today that the research on the small mammals that Dr. Davenport did here on site was in part to fulfill that IRS obligation for greater public good with a science purpose. So research and scientific study has been part of the language of the Wormslow Foundation since the inception of the Wormslow Foundation in the early 1950s. So we are carrying on that tradition today. And in fact, the very first thing that Craig and Diane and I did when we started thinking about the utilization of this property was, my question is, what is the highest and best use for this site? And what we did next was we went to Washington, D.C., we worked with the Conservation Fund and a number of their top staff, and we literally walked through the previous 8 generations and said, what would each of these generations do with this site today? What was most important to them, and how did that change over time? Each generation, from Noble Jones all the way through, had very clear challenges. Many of them are economic. Many of them are major historical events today, the Civil War being one very important era, changing much about large land owners at the time in the South. But even pre-Revolutionary War, every generation had significant challenges. How did they handle them, and what did they leave as a legacy for the next generation? How did they set up for the next generation to be able to carry on? And what would they think of what we did today? So the 3 guiding principles that truly define the work we do is, the number 1 goal is conservation of this site. Not preservation. We don't want to lock it up and not let anybody touch it. We want it to be utilized, but conservation rules. Number 2 is supporting research on the site. And number 3 is education. So those 3 goals are what we implement every single day on site. And it takes 3 partners to do that. It is critically important that we have the relationship with the University of Georgia and the entire University of Georgia system. We work with other universities and colleges throughout the state, but primarily we work with UGA. We also work very closely with the Department of Natural Resources, because they are now the owners of not just that 822 acres, but the Wormslow Foundation has also worked with the state to purchase Pigeon Island, and that's part of the Wormslow complex. So we now have over 1,000 acres, depending on how you count marsh, because it's a King's grant, so technically we own to the low marsh, not the high marsh. It's close to 1,300 acres of land, including freshwater ecosystems, definitely saltwater ecosystems, tidal creeks, extensive marshes, maritime forest. So the research that happens on site requires not just those 2 other partners, but the expertise within Georgia DNR and with UGA, so that we can ask the best questions. And one of the things that happened first on this site when I got here was I put together a science advisory council. And the skill sets were the most important to me. I literally made, on the x-axis of this chart, all the skill sets that I needed, from coastal policy experience, clear history, ecology, water issues. I needed geography, mapping, archaeology, and then on the y-axis, I made first, second, and third choices of who in the state of Georgia that I wanted to fill those roles. Remarkably, every top-tier person agreed to serve on the Wormslow Science Advisory Council, and still to this day serves on that council. It is time-consuming for them periodically, and their dedication and their engagement in this site is one of the reasons why the science and research that we're doing today is so strong, because it is correct for this site, but yet we don't use the site boundaries to geographically define what we do. We do not do any research on site that doesn't literally have broader impacts to the coast of Georgia. The research has to work for us here, but if it only works for us, that's not good enough. We want to be able to disseminate this so that it has application, sometimes immediate management decisions, to other coastal counties. We look at the 2 tiers of coastal counties for how we would like to be able to offer data that would not be able to be gathered by other people. So I look very closely as the director of the site at what the Skidaway Institute of Oceanography is doing, the kinds of research they're doing. They're primarily focused on blue water oceanography. The Sapelo Island Marine Institute, the Marine Extension here in Brunswick and here on Skidaway Island. The University of Georgia does a lot of research on the coast and is world renowned for its marsh work on Sapelo Island from Eugene Odom. The Skidaway Institute is a premier oceanography site in the United States and therefore the world. The research we do here, not only do I not want that to overlap or recreate anything that's being done already, but I want it to fill in the gaps that's not appropriate for SCIO or UGAMI or MERX. At the same time, the research that we do here on site, we follow what AAAS and the National Academies of Science have already identified are the most important research questions. So all the research here is focused on climate change and the effects of climate change. Looking at biodiversity, which includes invasive exotic species and their effect on ecosystems. Looking at freshwater issues, both for wildlife and for drinking, which includes groundwater. And we focus very clearly on epidemiology of migrating species of wildlife, because this incorporates all of the other areas of science that we focus on. As climate change effects start to be, we're able to record them in the environment, we're starting to see migration patterns change, disease transmission change, and one of the reasons that Wormslow is uniquely situated to be able to measure this is we have that 1,300 acres immediately adjacent to the most densely populated area in coastal Georgia. And so we are the green spot that attracts a lot of these migrating species to stop here. So being able to measure them, we are both able to attract them by doing nothing. They're attracted to come to this site. And so we can measure, count, look at whatever we need to. Yesterday morning, working with UGA students and faculty, we netted one of the monarch butterflies that is just starting to migrate back north. Capture the butterfly, we measure it, the wings, we measure the weight, we take spores off the abdomen of the insect, and that becomes part of a very large database. And so we release the animal right back on the exact same plant where we captured it. So that flyway that comes through is critically important. One of the things that we realized with that mark and recapture program is there is very recent evidence now, not just from what we're doing, but from a number of people working in the coastal area of South Carolina and Georgia, that there's an entirely different Atlantic flyway for monarch butterflies that come here. We're not necessarily part of the population that goes to Mexico. So this is very new information. These data are just emerging. One of the things that I give talks in schools, middle school and high schools, about science and having careers in science, and the biggest misconception that I hear from high school students today is that we have discovered almost everything that needs to be discovered about natural history. They know technology and technological tools are going to be emerging, evolving, and changing, but it's that not recognizing how much basic biology and ecological relationships we don't know anything about. Where does a monarch butterfly go? How do they do this migration? How is it physiologically possible? Such basic questions. So it's that excitement of learning, that excitement of unveiling these fundamentals that change the world as we know it.
So I want to ask you about science education, and maybe step back earlier to after you worked with Dr. Babbitt, and you became deeply involved with science education. You were teaching at Armstrong Atlantic. You also did work before your work here at Wormslow. Will you tell us about those years where you're working for NOAA and forget the name of it again, the Marine. What was the name of the Marine Institute?
The National Marine Sanctuary System.
National Marine Sanctuary System. Thank you.
After while I was running a private retail business for 10 years, which was a unique experience to run a private business, particularly as a young person looking at government regulations, compliance, being fully responsible at one point in time for a full-time staff of 5, making that payroll, working with the general public. At the same time, I was also working as a consultant to Georgia DNR and writing science material for them, and small science little booklets and pamphlets for Georgia DNR. I sold the business after 10 years, and I started teaching at Oatland Island Education Center in Savannah, Georgia.
What year is this?
This would have been in 1986. Oatland Island was surplus property from the federal government. It was originally a retirement home for railroad conductors, and very soon after that, it became the Center for Disease Control that's now in Atlanta. So it was their first labs. And they ran labs out there for many years. They did extensive research, and they did a lot of research for the military. When they built the new buildings in Atlanta, it became surplus property. And Chatham County was able to receive the property from the federal government to start an environmental education program. So there were 5 of us teaching there. We taught K through 12. Every day, a different class of students would come out. Each of us would have a class of 30 for that day. And we also cared for all of the animals that should have been in this area, and many of which are not today. For example, 2 Florida panthers, 2 black bears. We had otters in enclosures, eagles, owls, hawks, more than 30 alligators, 2 or 3 bobcats at the time, a small pack of timber wolves, 5 timber wolves when I was there. So each of us, as one of the 5 instructors, also cared for one of the habitats with these animals. It was a wonderful place to work, an amazing place to teach. The students were so receptive to this. They were excited to be out in the field and learning hard science in a way that they could engage with it outside of the classroom. So there was always a waiting list every day of the entire school year for classes to get in. As fast as we could answer the phones, classes would be scheduled before school started. And the only limiting factor was the number of teachers that Chatham County would support to be there. So still today, it's a wonderful place to go if you have a chance, Oatland Island Education Center. Immediately while I was working there, I became interested I was working with the Savannah Science Museum just as an individual supporter of the Science Museum, and realized that there were grants to be had for environmental education. So I put together an ad hoc group with the Marine Extension, with Oatland Island, with the Savannah Science Museum, to be able to coordinate efforts, interest, and more importantly, needs, so that we could collectively write grants to support additional programming. During the summers, we worked, of course, on a 9.5-month year as a teacher in Chatham County. I was teaching elder hostels and college groups in the Bahamas as a guest instructor for a consortium of 5 colleges. So this was on San Salvador Island. It was, once again, a federal government surplus property that was a research center. So my research focus at that time was on marine algae. So working with Savannah State University, I illustrated and did the collecting for a book on marine algae with Joe Richardson. So that book is still out today. Caribbean algae, yes, of San Salvador Island. So I wanted to be able, once I realized that that was possible, I put together this ad hoc group, and that's how I found out about the National Marine Sanctuary Program. This program is similar to the national parks. National parks are run by the Department of Interior, and the National Marine Sanctuary Program is part of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So through that affiliation, that ad hoc group, I was asked to apply for the job as education coordinator for Gray's Reef, which was a newly formed national marine sanctuary. Gray's Reef is 23 nautical miles offshore from Georgia, and it is an outcropping in an otherwise very sandy bottom ocean. So when you have shifting sands, shifting sediments, you don't have the attachment for sessile organisms. Once you have a hard bottom of lithified sediments, that's when you can start to create an invertebrate community, which then supports a vertebrate community. So this area was so important, and in fact it was named Gray's Reef after Milton Gray, who was an invertebrate marine collector for Harvard University, and he would come down on an annual basis and collect specimens from Gray's Reef, and the Gray collection at Harvard today is extensive and still widely used as a teaching collection. So I was hired in that position, and I worked on Skidaway Island for the National Marine Sanctuary Program at Gray's Reef as the education coordinator for 3 years, and then I was asked to come to Washington, D.C., and was promoted to be the education coordinator for all of the National Marine Sanctuaries, all 14 of them in the United States, which was a very exciting job for me. It was a fairly new program. We were remarkably well funded. The Marine Sanctuary Program attracted very well educated, highly motivated people that were working remarkably well together as a large team to both protect these most valuable areas in our coastal ocean environments, maintain the biodiversity, protect them against overfishing or encroachment from the oil industry, and hold them in perpetuity as treasures for the rest of the country. From that position, I was promoted to education coordinator for the National Ocean Service, which is one of the 5 arms of NOAA, and then was promoted again as the education director for NOAA in the office working directly under the Admiral Ladenbacher at the time, who was the Admiral of NOAA. So my office moved to the Department of Commerce building, downtown Washington, D.C., next door to the White House. And once again, that put me in the position of looking at the other areas of NOAA, including the National Weather Service. So it was a hugely exciting time because it was an opportunity to bring in practical science education into an agency which had always been very strong in science and research, and still is today, but to be able to bring in that education and outreach so that the citizens in the United States and around the world could better access that information, could better have an understanding of what the data mean and how it applies to their lives. And that is really the single most important thing to me, is both communicating those data for individual citizens to know more about their world, but to also be able to apply those data so that we make better management decisions. Whether this is policy at the national level, state level, county level, even looking at building codes or international trade, it is the entire spectrum from the smallest micro to the largest macro systems. If we can incorporate what we know about science and what we have learned through research of how ecosystems and literally the world works as one of the factors in making those decisions, we will be much more successful.
What was the dates of tenure for you with with NOAA? Or when did you leave? Yeah. Let's work backwards from there.
About 10 years ago, this is 15, was it 2005? Time flies
Somewhere
as you get older.
Okay.
I worked for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, for 12 years. So when I went to Washington, D.C., after about 3 years in Savannah, I went on a temporary 18-month assignment, which they kept extending, and then asked me to apply for jobs, and it became more permanent at the time. So when I retired from NOAA after 12 years, I realized I had worked myself from really exciting, fun, in-the-field jobs, working directly with students. My personal research was loggerhead sea turtles. So I was a research diver the entire time I was with NOAA, which required us diving a minimum of 1 day every month, regardless of the season of the year. So in January, we're out there diving, as well as beautiful days in August. And studying loggerhead sea turtles was important to me because I was tasked originally with interpreting a site, Gray's Reef, which is known for its invertebrate communities, to young students who are not the least bit interested in very nondescript, non-flashy, non-charismatic, oftentimes very small invertebrate community. But loggerhead sea turtles have that charisma. So if you can utilize an animal that students care about and can imagine and can see themselves interested in, and use that as the Trojan horse to transport them in, before they know it, they've learned all kinds of things about invertebrates, because that's what sustains the sea turtles themselves. So even looking at the carapace, the back of a sea turtle, the sea turtle shell, the encrusting organisms, the invertebrates that are on the shell, tell us where that turtle has been in the Atlantic Ocean. We can tell by the diversity, the variety, and the abundance of each of these organisms can tell us a tremendous about where what turtle has traveled. And one of the big gaps in knowledge at the time was we only knew information about the female loggerhead turtles, or any of the species of sea turtles, when the females are on the beach depositing their eggs, digging a nest, depositing eggs, and then walking back. We watch the young hatch, we know about that, and then as soon as they find their way back into the ocean, we know very little about the rest of their life cycle. We know practically nothing about the adult males. So it'd be as if we knew nothing about the human population except what happens in the maternity ward. Nothing about teenagers, nothing about anything else about their life, nothing else. So I was funded by the New England Aquarium in Boston and the Corps of Engineers, and my research project was attaching satellite transmitters to male loggerhead sea turtles. The reason both the Corps of Engineers wanted this research to be done because of the dredging operations the Corps is working on. Sea turtles at the time were listed species, either threatened species or endangered species, and they were being routinely killed in dredging operations that the Corps was responsible for. So they had the responsibility of having more information about how to lessen the deaths of these federally protected species. The New England Aquarium was interested in doing research on leatherback sea turtles. But catching leatherbacks offshore, attaching a transmitter to a turtle once they're on land is remarkably easy. They're on land, they move very slowly. It's not hard to run down a sea turtle, particularly when they're on the beach. But the males offshore are very difficult to catch. One is you have to find them, so it's a needle in a haystack. And with the amount of diving over a couple of years I had done offshore, I saw the males in caves in about 60 feet of water in and around Gray's Reef. So my proposal was catching these, diving into the caves, going into the caves, pulling these male sea turtles out, bringing them to the surface, attaching a satellite transmitter to them, and releasing them, and then following their movements. This worked great. The first thing was being able to catch them. So I made a very large net, which had 2 steel bars at the top, which were welded together, and then a very strong shrimp net on it so that I could open this and then be able to close it and clamp it shut to bring the turtle to the surface. And once the turtle got to the surface, we're working off of a research vessel, so the winch would come down, and I designed what looks like a playpen. So there's netting in the bottom, and then there are bolts that were 14 inches long on the sides. So the frame was made out of PVC, both on the bottom and the top, so it would collapse down, so I could slide the turtle onto it, but once it was lifted by the boom, the sides would be raised, and the turtle couldn't either jump off or fall off in the air till we got him on the ship. Fortunately, it worked terrific. There were some exciting stories about catching these very large reptiles who look as if they're not comfortable on land. They're very comfortable in the water. They circumnavigate the entire North Atlantic Ocean. They go from here all the way around to the Atlantic Gyre, north of the equator and back again. They've been around for more than 60 million years. They're very successful swimmers. So getting a male sea turtle to go in the opposite direction that it wants to go in its environment was more of a challenge than I anticipated.
How did you do that? How does one do that?
So first you have to find them. So I'm carrying all this equipment, and I'm also have on headsets so that I can talk to the research vessel at the time. So the full head mask that I'm wearing has audio in it, which is transmitting sound to the ship, because no one knows where I am in the water. And there's on each of these dives, there's one other person with me. We always dive with a buddy system. So I would dive into the cave, pull the sea turtle out backwards, just bracing my feet on some part of the cave and pulling it out backwards. And the sea turtles, when they're in the state that they're underneath inside the caves, they're lung-breathing animals, so they need to breathe air. But they're able to absorb just enough exchange of gases through some of the skin on their flippers so that they can stay underneath water for hours at a time, but their metabolism slows down for that to happen. So they're not as active when they're in these caves. So they were slow enough moving that until I roused it too much, I had some control over pulling it out, getting it inside this enclosure that I made for it, and then creating an ascent which was slow enough to be able to get the turtle up. There were instances where I couldn't get the turtle completely in the net. They're very strong. Their jaws are more powerful than an alligator's. They crush conch shells as part of their diet. So if you can imagine a conch shell just being completely crushed so that it could be swallowed, they're very powerful jaws. They do not want to hurt a human. They have no interest in hurting us. But they are very clear they do not want to be handled. So they're moving their head wildly and just trying to snap at anything that they can get to just to be able to get away. Once again, they were doing exactly what they should be doing, but it's really important not to have an arm or a leg or anything available to them. Of course, being underwater at 60 feet, it's harder to control because you're not standing up. It's in a weightless environment. It's like being in space, so you don't have gravity working with you. Both of you are moving in this dance where you can't push against anything or hold anything. When you're catching an alligator in your backyard as a child, small ones, you're standing on the ground. You can grab the mouth, you can put your foot on its tail, you can use gravity. You can't do that in the ocean. So it's much more difficult to have control over the animals. So there were times where I was just holding on to the carapace and had no idea how far I was going to be pulled through the ocean by these 300, 350-pound animals. The one thing that I realized the hard way was you can't keep the sea turtle from swimming where it's going to swim. It is swimming, but they'll spin on a dime. I figured I could turn them. So if you grab the top of the carapace and the bottom of the carapace, you can spin them easily. So I couldn't make them, they always want to go down and towards Africa. They just head east, but I could turn them. So that was the only leverage that I had in the water. So I could turn them and just get their head in and then get them to the surface before their jaws ate their way through the capture net. That was the other problem. The speed was really important because they would literally be able to just eat their way through the net.
That's only quite an adventure. Hard to give that up to go to DC?
So that's what I realized. So being promoted was not what I loved doing. So I moved out of DC and bought an inn in the country on the Blue Ridge Parkway and ran an inn for 10 years. Meanwhile, I was also director of an art museum in the area, which became famous when George Bush, on his Saturday afternoon address at one point in time, said the two biggest tax boondoggles in the United States was the bridge to nowhere in Alaska and the Teapot Museum in Sparta, North Carolina.